members to build their trading capacity. And I think that this shows our shared belief that trade is one of the best the benefits of trade. Seizing opportunities is just part of the story. This is not the whole story. And this brings me to my second point, which is that while these technological advances have generated important benefits for economies overall, they can, in fact, have adverse impact on specific groups or regions. So this is also part of the story. Technological progress, for example, is an important source of changes in the labor market changes. So higher productivity is responsible for 8 out of 10 job losses in some economies. So it's not cheaper imports, it's just new technologies, innovation. And these forces, they also have an impact on the overall structure of the employment. So productivity gains from new technologies are driving shifts in employment patterns. And they are dramatically reducing the demand for labor in sectors such as agriculture or manufacturing. And at the same time, of course, the proportion of jobs in services keeps on increasing. And all over the world, the demand for skilled workers increases, while the number of low or middle skill jobs is declining. Now, these changes, they raise important adjustment challenges as workers who lose their jobs in declining sectors or in those exposed regions, they may not always be well equipped to adapt to these changes and to fill the jobs that are opening up somewhere else. So the benefits that clearly exist across the economy is of little comfort for someone who lost his job. Now, developing effective policies to support people and to adjust to this new reality is fundamental. We need to ensure that the benefits of economic progress reaches, if not everybody, as many people as possible. And that leads me to the third and final point. We need to find more creative and effective ways to adjust to economic change. And an important element here is domestic policy. Sustainable and balanced economic progress will hinge on the ability of economies to adjust to changes and promote greater inclusiveness. And this includes, for example, more active labor market policies, education policies, and the provision of support for workers. Active labor market policies can help workers retrain and find new job openings, assist them with relocation, encouraging their transition and offering new opportunities, more comprehensive, flexible and forward-looking policies in investments and investments in education from the primary all the way to post-secondary levels. They're also critical to equip individuals to take advantage of the opportunities of this new age of technology. In addition to that, experience suggests that success in facilitating these adjustments involves finding an appropriate balance between the labor market flexibility on the one hand and the proper employment standards on the other. So there is a balance to be found here, and it's not an easy one, I have to tell you. And other policies also that increase competitiveness, efficient and reliable infrastructure, for example, or well-functioning financial markets, measures that improve the predictability of trade and that help to level the playing field, all those can also make the economy more responsive to the challenges and facilitate adjustment. What is a big problem that we have here is that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Each country will have to figure out its own recipe, its own policies, and the appropriate mix of policies that will work for them, for their particular needs. And what we also see is that some countries, some economies, seem to be adjusting better than others to the challenges and opportunities offered by trade and technology. And looking at these experiences, particularly of those that are adjusting better, can help to shed light to possible ways to approach these challenges. So I'm very pleased to say that with the support of the Swedish government, we will be working to deepen the work in this area. We will be compiling a dossier of adjustment policies in selected countries and this will build precisely on the 2017 World Trade Report that I mentioned, and draw further lessons from different experiences that countries have had. It will aim to identify success stories which can further inform the conversation on these issues. Now, expanding this research will be very valuable, but this isn't the limit of the WTO's contribution on these issues. Quite far from it. I think we provide a forum for governments to meet, to talk, negotiate. We offer a platform to discuss how to maximize the benefits of economic changes, minimize the adverse consequences. This will be brought to focus at the Ministerial Conference in Buenos Aires next month, in a couple of weeks actually. A range of issues are being discussed by members, and inclusivity is a common thread to all those discussions. Many members are talking about how to help small and medium enterprises, how to leverage the potential of e-commerce to ensure that more people can join the global trade flows. And those conversations are ongoing. The Buenos Aires meeting will be an important opportunity to advance all these debates and ensure that more economic opportunities reach as many people as possible. So fostering this greater inclusivity is one of the most pressing challenges of our age. The solutions are not evident, but we cannot avoid the discussion. We cannot shy away from this discussion, and we cannot make believe that it doesn't exist. Multi-stakeholder approaches like the global deal can make an important contribution here. I really look forward to continue this collaboration with the Swedish government in tackling these issues, exploring the continued contribution that trade and the WTO can make. So thank you all very much. I'm really looking forward to hear what the panelists have to add to this conversation. And thank you all for coming and being here with us today.
Director General. Director General, Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed. Allow me to let you leave the stage. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much.
So I think we are clear that there is, first of all, no one solution is, or set of solutions is being proposed anyway by the global deal. What we're looking at is what we were hearing just now from the Director General, is perhaps a series of solutions which are relevant to each individual country. If you're finding it difficult to hear either what I'm saying or the translation, do make sure that you use your headphones. And also to say that if you would like to tweet, the hashtag Global Deal is available to you to do that. So let me introduce the next panellists to you, who I think are making their way to the stage. Hi, Mark. There's no stopping the Brits, is there? So to my left here, Mark Pearson, Deputy Director of Employment, Labour and Social Affairs at the OECD. SABINA DEWAN, who is President and Executive Director of JustJobs Network, and Professor Jens SUEDEKUM, who is from Henrich-Heine University in Düsseldorf. Welcome to you all. As I said at the start, I think our plan now really is to look at what it is that we're experiencing in different parts of the world, and then move on to the second panel and get a little bit more specific about what solutions apply where, and then we know where we're heading with what the global deal can offer us. So Jens, allow me to call on you first. I know that you've done extensive research on the subject of the fallout and where we experience this social inequality widening, and we're going to talk to you first about in the more developed economies, and then come to Sabina, if we may, to talk about developing economies. So Jens, first to you.
So thanks, Tanya. Mr. Prime Minister, Director Generals, I'm very pleased to be invited to this very high-level and great event. And so you're going to find a draft that Sabina and I have put together. And I think the paper, it should be in front of you on the table. And the point that we try to make in this joint paper is that trade creates enormous benefits, actually to an extent that it has the potential to make everybody better off. But the very important insight is this doesn't happen automatically. It requires, in our view, comprehensive and complementary set of policies to make sure that the gains from globalization and trade are actually widely shared across the society. And as an economist, so I'm an economic theorist, I should say that this message is actually not very new. So it's an integral part actually of traditional economic textbooks that trade liberalization policies and trade also require complementary policies that distribute the gains, because this is something that the market does not generate and deliver on itself. So as consumers, we virtually all benefit from trade because trade generates so many new, better, cheaper products. It fosters innovation, it generates economic growth. But especially on the labor market, the situation is more complex. So on the labor market, there are groups that also enormously benefit from trade in terms of higher wages and earnings. But there are also, and I'm talking here especially about the developed countries, so for example, the United States or European countries, there are also groups where on the labor market the effects of trade are more problematic and adverse, because trade generates at the individual level strong adjustment costs, it generates change, and it generates the need for individuals to adjust and adapt to this change. And it has effects on wages and factor prices, which can be such that some individuals actually see stagnating wages as a result of trade. So now the textbook model strongly suggests that because there's this overall welfare gain from trade, there is the potential, so the cake is growing, so there's the potential that no individual portion actually has to shrink. But as I said, this doesn't happen automatically. It requires action by stakeholders to make sure that no individual portion shrinks. And the question is which policies can actually ensure this sharing of the gains in a broad sense across society, right? If you take it literal, then this redistribution would mean passive monetary transfers, for example, via the tax system. But I agree very much with the World Trade Report and with what Dr. General AZEVÊDO has just said, that the labor market is really key in this discussion, and that labor market policies should be really seen as an integral part responsible for sharing the gains of globalization. So we know there's abundant evidence from various countries now that trade shocks can actually lead at the individual level to job displacements, and individual workers may find it really difficult to transition into different jobs, to new jobs in different sectors of the economy. And any effort, be it from public policies or from firms or from unions, that actually help facilitate this transition into new jobs, for example, through retraining, through qualification, lifelong learning efforts, is something that will actually be very helpful to share the gains from globalization very broadly. And let me, that's my last point, emphasize one particular aspect that I find important, and that's not so present in the discussion about this. We know there is evidence that the adverse effects of trade on the labor markets, that they tend to be concentrated very often in particular regions within countries, because industries and sectors, they are not distributed equally across space. They tend to concentrate in particular regions. And so the negative consequences, these job displacements, the reduced wages, they are much more pressing in some regions. So I'm thinking, for example, of the American Rust Belt, the industrial areas of northern England, or the Ruhr area in Germany, where I'm coming from. And when you look at recent election results, right, these votes for protectionist policy agendas or populism, they tended to be much stronger in these regions where the adverse labor market effects were concentrated. So I think labor market policies are a very important part of the answer that policy should give and stakeholders should give. But we also have to recognize this regional dimension, right? Because the adaptation to shocks would require also regional mobility, so that people are also willing to move to different regions. And we know that this is very difficult, especially for the groups who stand to lose most on the labor market from the adverse consequences. So I think, and that would be my, my policy statement, I think we should view regional policies as an important complement to this effort of labor market policies, and really think of this as also being an important part of the overall policy package that needs to be put in place to share the benefits of globalization. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jens. So that's really a comment on what's happened in the more industrialized or developed economies. And as you say, it is quite evident in the Ruhr. I was there quite recently in Essen, where you do see exactly this happening. Sabina, if I could turn to you and ask you a little bit what you're seeing in other parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I just want to start by thanking Prime Minister LÖFVEN for the invitation to be here today, Director General AZEVÅDO, and I would be remiss not to recognize the former Foreign Minister of Norway, BØRGE BRENDE, whose government provided my organization the seed funding to exist, so thank you. It's a privilege to be here. And Tanya, thank you for your excellent question, and my co-author on the paper, Professor Jens, and I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name. I have three quick comments that I'd like to make. I wanted to start by underscoring the need for an honest narrative on trade. Let it be clear, I am a firm believer in the benefits of trade. But we cannot deny, as Jens just mentioned, we cannot deny that trade comes with a restructuring of economic activity that leaves some workers better off, some workers with jobs, while others lose them. It raises the wages for some workers and leads to a decline or stagnation of wages for others. Trade is complicated, but it is anything but free. Its benefits come at a cost, and unless we start by acknowledging the costs of trade, we cannot fix trade. And what we will see is a continuation of the decline and waning of public support for trade. So I think the first thing that we need to do is to acknowledge both the costs of trade across the developed and developing world, and craft an honest narrative. And from this flows my second point, which is we've heard a lot this morning, and I think that the pervasive view among policymakers and scholars and practitioners is that the costs of trade are a redistribution problem. That if we just create domestic policies like trade adjustment assistance or social security, social safety nets, social protection, however you'd like to call the set of policies, if we just do that, then the benefits of trade will be widely distributed and everything will be okay. I think that that is a deeply flawed assumption. Redistribution is important, but before redistribution, we must actually think about how trade is structured and governed to begin with. We live in an era of value chains. World trade in intermediate goods is now greater than all non-oil traded goods put together. 80% of global trade measured in gross exports is now linked to the production of multinational firms. Take an iPhone, for example. Designed by Apple in Cupertino, assembled by Foxconn, a Taiwanese company based in China, components from over 700 suppliers across over 30 countries. We live in an era of global value chains, and trade is increasingly exchange among corporate entities determined by their bottom line, governed by the private law of contracts. So how do we govern this form of trade? And how do we reinforce the value of work and the value of workers and keep the asymmetries of power in check? How do we institute new regulations and transparency in this 21st century landscape of global value chains and trade through global value chains? Unless we answer these questions, focusing on redistribution is addressing the symptom, not the cause. And finally, I'll just, if you'll allow me 1 more minute, just to make a point about where I think the global deal can make a really significant contribution. This is an excellent opportunity. The global deal is an excellent opportunity to chart a new path forward, to break from business as usual. I think first, We must devise a real and provocative research agenda, and I underscore the word provocative. We must not sacrifice nuance, and we must not sacrifice an honest narrative for the sake of political correctness. Political correctness is for us in this room. The average person out there doesn't look at political correctness. They look at how this transforming world with technology and value chains and climate change is affecting their ability to provide for themselves and their families. So let's move beyond political correctness and come up with a real research agenda around trade and the way that it's affecting people's lives. So once we have this research agenda, we must operationalize this research agenda, not just by working with multilateral institutions and with tripartite partners and multinationals. That's extremely important, but we must also equally work with grassroots organizations, civil society, small businesses in global deal partner countries on the ground to see how integration into value chains is really playing out on the ground. And it's critical to understand these issues before we can figure out how to treat them and to form real partnerships and social dialogue in communities, in cities, at the local level, in global deal countries. Thank you.
Sabina, thank you very much. I think it's becoming clear that the causes of growing inequality and therefore probably the solutions are manifold. Trade, of course, is something that we all want to continue to do. There's an enormous impetus behind increasing trade flows and internationalizing trade. Also, labour market flexibility. So how possibly can they sit along the other problems that we have, which is growing inequality, also the growth of technology, and in many countries, an ageing working force, or an ageing population, I should say. Mark, what could you add to that discussion to perhaps try to reduce its complexity?
Great. Well, yes, thank you very much. And indeed, thank you very much to the Swedish Prime Minister for this brilliant initiative of the Global Deal. I think that's opening up the possibilities of having a proper conversation internationally about these issues. And yes, Tanya, you're quite right. We're not just talking about one megatrend. We're talking about three incredibly important megatrends going on at the same time. Yes, trade, wonderful. We have the globalization, the opportunity to sell products, to buy products from all around the world. That should be making us richer. We have technology, which should be vastly increasing our ability to produce goods and services. And we have population aging, so we're living longer. We have more opportunities to take advantage of what should be this increase in consumption. And yet, we look at our outcomes, and we're in a mess. We're not using those megatrends and turning them into better living standards, certainly not better living standards for all. We have higher unemployment in some countries. We have sluggish wages due to low productivity growth, job insecurity, and poor quality jobs. And so we're not managing to turn the advantages of those megatrends into what we need for people. And I'm not surprised, therefore, that we're seeing backlash against globalization. Even in a country such as, say, Denmark, if you look at people who lose their jobs due to technology or trade, and you follow their incomes, even after 5 years, on average, those people have not yet got back up to the income that they had before they lost their job. In a country like the UK, on average, after 5 years, you're 30% poorer than before you lost your job. So displacement due to trade or technology is something that people are right to be suspicious about, because it might be making the economy better off, but it's not making the individuals affected better off, or at least not all of them. And I think that's the real challenge we've got. Taking all those trends together, what we're seeing, it's not exactly that we're seeing fewer low-skilled jobs and more high-skilled jobs. In fact, we're seeing more low-skilled jobs and more high-skilled jobs. The jobs that we're losing are the jobs in the middle. The good jobs, the jobs that most people could aspire to. You don't need to have a fantastic level of intelligence, but you could imagine that you'd have a good standard of living. And in developed countries, those jobs are going relatively rapidly. Now, what's the consequences of that? One of the consequences we've already heard is this widening in income inequality. So, you know, 3 decades ago, top 10% in rich countries were earning 7 times as much as the bottom 10%. Now, 10 times as much. But it goes way beyond just inequality. If you look at countries like, say, the United States or Canada, before the economic crisis, and you asked people if they were middle class or lower class or upper class, 70% of people in North America were saying that they were middle class. You ask them now, it's down to 50%. And I think that's a sign of the loss of confidence in the economy, the loss of confidence in the future. We do lots of statistical analysis about whether it's trade that causes these changes or technology. For what it's worth, our most recent study suggests it's mainly technology driving these changes rather than trade. I think it's a bit of an artificial discussion, however. I mean, the reason why firms introduce new technologies is because they want to trade. They want to become richer. So you can't really separate these things out. I think we need to treat them together as mega trends that are affecting the labour market. And for sure, the response, yes, I absolutely agree with what people have been saying. We do need to look at our domestic policies. We need a much better inclusive growth approach, which involves education, involves better health policies, better adaptation when people actually do get displaced from jobs. I do think it goes beyond that, though. I don't think that we should stop at just saying this is a problem for domestic policies. And this is really coming to what Sabina said, which I agree with. We need to have an honest conversation about trade. We need to have an honest conversation about other aspects of the international system. Will we really get inclusive growth if we don't address the issue of tax evasion and tax avoidance? Will we really get inclusive growth and confidence in the international system if we don't start looking at international labour standards or corruption? And responsible business conduct. I mean, this is an area where the OECD has done a lot of work to try and get some sort of responsibility for the entire value chain of companies that are based in a developed country, so that they do actually have some sort of responsibility about labour standards right the way through the value chain, right the way down into the countries where they do the production. So I think, yes, certainly we need to do an awful lot in the domestic sphere, but let's not forget all this huge international agenda that we must address, and I really hope that we can address this as part of the global deal going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me just ask you, Jens, very briefly, and if I just get some brief answers. If we are to assume that there is enormous momentum behind the desire to continue to promote free trade and also to maintain flexible working conditions, would it be enough to try to address this problem broadly, and now I'm talking about the more developed economies, would it be enough to say to companies, look, you cannot pay the people at the top of the company multiple times, several hundreds maybe, what you pay people at the bottom of the company. If you think that your company is changing because of technology, you must take a commitment to train people to prepare for that and address these problems and leave the fundamental drive towards more technology in an open world absolutely unbridled.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a very important point. What has been called domestic policies, I would say, I mean, that's much broader. It's not just public policies that is important, but also efforts of firms and unions and stakeholders in the labor market. And coming to this point about retraining and qualification, I think that's where firms and unions play a very vital role, right? Because you can think of this as being an insurance mechanism. I very much agree with Mark saying about the really adverse effects of job displacement. So firms, if they already, before the displacement occurs, right, so in the good times, train their workforce, right, so that's something that is beneficial to the firms, right, it pays off, but it's also beneficial for the workers in the negative or in the case of a job loss, because it helps him or her adapt and move back quicker into better jobs. So I think this retraining effort is really something where not only the government plays a very important role, but all actors in the labor market can contribute to really have this inclusive growth approach.
And Sabina, Mark brought up the idea of tax avoidance. That's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about in the UK, or how to stop people doing it, rather. And also the idea that governments have a role to play really in, I think, this idea of re-education and anticipating trends. Again, how powerful, and corruption, of course, how powerful in stopping corruption, how powerful would those initiatives be in trying to address this problem?
Well, I couldn't agree with Mark more. I think that we have to look at all of these different aspects. If we look at tax avoidance, in India, where I live, less than 3% of the population actually pays income tax. So I don't know how you build an infrastructure, a social infrastructure in a country where you just don't simply have the resources. But I think that we have to take tax, corruption, and re-education differently. So my organization, we do a lot of work on workforce development and skills. And one of the points that I always like to make there is that skills is not a panacea to addressing all the changes that are confronting our economies today. It's an important part of the equation. But you tell me how you skill 356 million people between the ages of 10 and 24 in India alone, that do not even have a requisite level of education. A 3-month, 6-month, or a year-long training program does not prepare them for any kind of economic mobility or, dealing with building a livelihood for themselves. So we really need to balance these sort of short-term measures with the longer-term continued investments in anti-corruption, tax avoidance, so that we can have better, solid education and health in these countries as well.
Mark, do you think there is a broad acceptance by governments, perhaps in faster growing economies? I remember when I lived in the States in between 2003 2006, there was a general view, and this of course just ahead of the financial crisis, there was a general view and a general expression, an incoming tide lifts all boats. We know that not to be the case, and the financial crisis has exacerbated that particular problem. Do you think governments now are prepared to be less focused on economic growth at any cost and look now at this business of tax avoidance that we see in many countries, probably all countries of the world, and also the question of corruption and basic levels of education?
Well, I don't think that's an anti-growth strategy that you've talked about, actually.
No, it isn't, but I wonder if there is a greater, of course not, but there's been this greater focus on, oh, well, look, it doesn't matter because the economy's growing. Let's not worry too much about these little details. These little details have now become paramount.
Yeah, I get you. I think that's right. I mean, I think we are also just struggling with the fact that people no longer trust governments as much as they used to be doing the right thing. And so we do have to take seriously what the authors talked about, having an open dialogue about trade. It's an open dialogue really about where our economies are growing. No, I don't think that it's acceptable in many countries as it was before, to see companies go round engaging in corrupt business practices, for example. So I think there has been a move, a greater willingness for countries to start addressing these issues. I say start addressing because, you mentioned the UK. The UK is starting to address tax avoidance and evasion. Yes, I think that's right, starting. Boy, there's a long way to go if we look at an awful lot of countries to actually start putting into practice the international agreements that are in place. A lot more needs to be done here. So it's not, I don't think, that we're scrabbling around for new policies in many areas. What we're actually wanting to do is to see a little bit more action on the areas where we know that we need to make progress.
Right, well, I think that's an excellent lift-off point to move on to our next panel. Please allow me to thank Professor Jens SUEDEKUM, Sabina SUEDEKUM, Sabina DEWAN, President of Executive Director of JustJobs, and Mark Pearson. Thank you. Right, so let's move on very swiftly because I'm aware that I'm not doing my job properly because I'm allowing time to slip. Guy RYDER, please, the Director General of the International Labour Organization, please come up, and Abdul Fattah, or Mr. Hassan, who is the Minister of Labour and Social Affairs in Ethiopia. BRENDE, the president of the World Economic Forum, Pierre HABBARD, who is the acting General Secretary of the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD, and JOAKIM, who is Group External Affairs Director at Vodafone Group. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us. Guy, I'm going to start with you on my right here. We were hearing a little earlier that there is this very delicate balance between labour market flexibility, which companies always seek, and the need for fairness. How do you square that circle?
Thank you very much, Tanya. Very.
And can I ask all of you to turn up your mics? Are you having a problem hearing us all? Because that's really frustrating, and I'm really sorry. So we're all going to press plus here and hope that nothing goes dramatically wrong. Yep. Could you press the plus sign? Not on the headphones, but on the mic thing. Is that better? Yes? Good. Yes. Okay. Guy.
Alternatively, I could just shout a bit.
You can shout. You can shout.
Firstly, Tanya, and to the organisers, thank you very much for including us in this very important conversation. You've asked me to say something about this vexed issue of flexibility.
Yep.
I've been struck by the previous panel and what was said in the introductions, that the term flexibility has been thrown about in meaning rather different things, actually. And I think it's important that we try to distinguish what we mean when we talk about flexibility. Some occasions we talk about the flexibility of an economy. I think I would rather talk about the adaptability of an economy, the capacity of an economy to move, particularly in the context of our current discussion, to move, to react to the opportunities and, of course, the challenges which arise from trade and from trade changes in trade regimes. In that regard, I would argue that the best guarantor of what I would call adaptability is dialogue. It is a capacity of governments to sit with their employer community and their trade unions and talk their way through to the right types of solutions in that sense of adaptability. And of course, that is where the value, I think, of the global dialogue is particularly evident. There's another meaning to the term flexibility, labour market flexibility in its more pure form, where we tend to see, wrongly in my view, a play-off between flexibility of labour markets on one side and labour standards and conditions of work on the other. This is a false conundrum, because the successful economies, the economies that have done it well, and you'll think I'm sucking up to the Prime Minister if I cite Sweden, but why not do it? Sweden is one of the countries which has both ensured the right types of flexibility in its labour markets with very high quality employment conditions. So I would argue against the notion that this is a zero sum, that you have to do more flexibility at the cost of good jobs or vice versa. It is not like that. We've heard Roberto say this morning, and he's absolutely right, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It's not wise people sitting in Geneva or New York or anybody else which is going to dictate the right way to move. Each country needs to find the right solutions to its circumstances. Takes you back to dialogue, doesn't it? It takes you back to the need for dialogue. You know, on the basis that dialogue is a good way, I think, of coming up with the right types of balances. It's a good way to make people feel involved in processes. You know, if you're involved in a discussion, however difficult it can be, you're much more likely to accept the outcome as legitimate. Sort of on the principle that if you're not at the table, you're likely to be on the menu. People want to be involved in the dialogue process. Now, I think the global dialogue can help us forward in two arenas, if you like. One is the national arena, and it is encouraging to see more and more countries signing up to the global deal, and we can say a great deal more about that. But arising from the conversation that has taken place here in the WTO this morning, I think we need also to improve dialogue in the international system, and I'll explain what I mean. A number of colleagues have talked about the need for, I'll use their phrase, an honest dialogue about trade. I would say a credible dialogue about trade. I do not wish to impugn people's intentions. But we have been stuck, I fear, in a sort of a binary discussion over the last, well, probably as long as the WTO has existed, if I can be honest, a discussion which tends to be, or not a discussion, two parallel discourses between those who have acted, excuse my language, as the cheerleaders of trade liberalisation and not really gone beyond that, and those others, and we're seeing the growth of that, who are now saying, actually, trade is not the way. Trade liberalisation, open trading system is not the way we want to go. The rise of populism. So you've got two irreconcilable discourses here. The credible dialogue has to take place somewhere in the middle, which is being honest, credible, to say, yeah, as everybody has agreed here, trade is the engine of growth and greater prosperity, but no, it is not automatic. And if it's not automatic that those gains are shared sufficiently broadly, what do we have to do? What do we have to do? And a lot of the answer lies in labour markets, but as we've heard already this morning, it lies also in many other areas of policy intervention. And something I think we've done very badly over the last 20 or 30 years is to have this integrated policy approach. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Singapore conference of the WTO know that at least in terms of labour and trade we agreed to go our separate ways. And for reasons which we all know about and they're sensitive. But it's actually time to bring back an integrated approach to international policy making. We have the framework for doing that in the form of the United Nations 2030 Development Agenda. I think we have to learn the lessons from that, and I think the global dialogue can help that international dialogue as much as it can help all those series of national dialogues that we need to see growing.
Right, thank you very much. So on the subject of national dialogues, we've already established that solutions are very different for very different countries and very different situations. So let me turn over now to Mr. Hassan, who is the Minister of Labour and Social Affairs of Ethiopia, a country that has embraced enormous amounts of technology and development very, very quickly. Over to you.
Thank you. First of all,
I'm just going to interrupt you again. If you can't hear, there's one of these somewhere under your desk. Stick it on, and I think that will help you hear better. Okay? Apparently, that technology works. Good.
Thank you, Tanya. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank His Excellency Prime Minister STEFAN for inviting Ethiopia to be part of this very important forum. To begin with, we live in an increasingly globalized world where interrelations determine the future of nations, where technological change is becoming ever more rapid, where international successes affect all aspects of national, economic, political, and social life. In this world, countries have to confront both opportunities as well as challenges so as not to be left behind. Therefore, in this regard, what the global deal plays is a very important role, which corresponds to the concern of our nations, especially in a country like Ethiopia, and it will also contribute to strengthen the common efforts that can change the impact of globalization on our socio-economic performance. We can benefit a lot from this global partnership as it focuses on enhancing social dialogue and sound industrial relations. In our continuous efforts and commitment towards achieving sustainable development goals and sustainable and social development, Ethiopia attaches greater importance to social dialogue and tripartism. We have ratified most of the core conventions of the International Labour Organization and also the Tripartite Convention number 144, 1976. We have a well-organized tripartite structure whereby the government, employers, workers' organizations come together to discuss the issues of social dialogue and decent work. The government of Ethiopia, above all, recognizes that improved labor administration and the labor relations lead to better working conditions. In this regard, as a country, we are committed to maintain harmonious and stable labor relations. So I think a global deal also can contribute to the existing standards and the systems that we had. and it will serve as a global forum where we can deepen our experiences and also share some other values. Perhaps the most difficult task will be to develop greater organizational capacity, because without capacity it will be very difficult for any country to actually benefit from the globalization. So the capacity of employers, the capacity of workers, not just to bring about a change, but also that will also enhance their capacity to manage change. Eradicating also poverty is also another very important issue, and also in order to sustain development, which is also our overriding concern, and also contribute to the well-being of the society, I think the issue of eradicating poverty is very important in a country like Ethiopia. We are of the view that the effective cooperation and the partnership among important actors in the multilateral system is central to collective efforts of all. And I think it will also ensure the implementation of the Agenda 2030, that's the Sustainable Development Goals. We also recognize the importance of global and strong national ownership of the Sustainable Development Goals as a key element to the realization of the transformational agenda. Ethiopia, in this respect, welcomes the efforts being made by the Global Deal in line with the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goal 8, Goal 10, and also Goal 17. Just to share some views in relation to the trade aspects, we recognize that sustainable trade and investment and also broad-based inclusive economic growth highly require the environment where internationally recognized worker rights are protected. In order to incorporate trade aspects in the Global Deal initiative, we are of the view that we need to work towards increasing coordination between labor and also trade authorities. And we need to link trade policies with labor policies as well. The final point, which is the way forward, I would like to raise two important issues. We believe that our determination and the seriousness to cope with an open world rely on the strength of our institutions of social dialogue. Without social dialogue, it will be very difficult for the world to benefit from the interventions of trade. Clearly, the workers, the employers, and the government working together have a key role to play in building the institutions that can sustain democracy in our societies as well. Finally, tripartite arrangement should also be examined in light of the emerging globalization of the world economy. And within the existing realities in each country, as has been said earlier, there is no one-size-fits-for-all formula. It is actually up to the countries to tailor and to develop their policies. There is also a need to increase our commitment to better coordination of trade and labor policies, as I said earlier. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. So these are one of the issues that I want to contribute.
Don't turn your mic off. We might want to talk to you a bit later on. Thank you. So, Børge, you're now heading up the World Economic Forum, so it's a very good meeting point for people from all sorts of different nationalities and parts of this partnership, companies and so on, NGOs, governments. So you've only been a very short time in the job, but just to force you to hit the ground running, what is popping out to you as some of the solutions that might be at hand here? Some of the low-hanging fruit, I suppose you could say.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you to Prime Minister STEFAN LÖFVEN for your initiative when it comes also to this grand deal. A fair deal, and also to Director General ROBERTO AZEVÉDO for the important role of WTO in this. I think part of the solution, Tanya, is in this room and this building, because what we tend to forget is that the multilateral trading system is a prerequisite also for a fair deal. if all countries don't have the same access to the markets, and if countries are not treated in a fair way, then we really will not succeed. The multilateral system secures that not only the big players will decide everything, but also that smaller and medium-sized countries are part of this. And this is so important to know, protect. And I have to say, I also saw the financial crisis unfolding in 2008. It is the big recession in many ways, but it did not end into a depression. That could have easily have happened if we were not coming together, first in the G20 context with massive fiscal stimulus against some economists' advice, and also an extraordinary unorthodox monetary policy. But on top of it, the WTO was a bulwark against protectionism, because it's very easy when you see these kind of challenges to say, no, we'll just protect myself and we will stop trading. We avoided that because we had the rules and regulations by the WTO. And I have to say that we tried that solution of going into protectionism in the 30s. So the reaction after 29 was beggar your neighbor, and then we saw the global GDP fell with 25%. The global trade fell with 50% in 3-4 years, and we got massive unemployment. Massive unemployment. So I think based on that, we have to also moving forward in Buenos Aires and other areas, we have, in my view, to strengthen the WTO and the international trade rules and regulations. But I think that in the future, we also have to make sure that the trade rules also open up for necessary domestic policy space. And Stefan, the Prime Minister of Sweden, mentioned this, that you also have to use that space in your own country to make sure that you address some of the new challenges that this fourth industrial revolution is causing, this also globalization leads to. And I think the Nordic countries, of course I'm not objective, but I think that what the Nordic countries have done is that you have this flexi-security. You have upheld the labor standards and the salaries, but a company in the Nordic countries know that if you are losing a lot of money and you have to close down, that can happen. Then you can do that, and the state takes the responsibility then to move someone away from one area of business to another one. But if you as a company know that you will, even if you're losing a lot of money, bleeding, you cannot change because you have to stick to this, that is a kind of situation that also makes it harder to employ people. You will not see willingness to employ young people. And you know, we should not forget that domestic policies still do matter. Argentina was the richest country in the world after the Second World War. It was not that after 15 years it took to change economic realities. My country, I will not start a competition with Sweden here, but my country, Norway, was the poorest in Europe 120 years ago, together with Iceland and Ireland. 800,000 left for the US. Today, Norway is not in that category, but we built out education for every child. 99% of our children are still in governmental schools. We built a robust tax system. The ownership to gas, oil, and also hydro was mainly administered also by the government, but we still have a very competitive economy. I think we can be inspired of some of these policies. And this is also the World Economic Forum's competitiveness report that comes out every year. It also puts those countries scoring quite high. that also are upholding labor standards, that are using a lot of resources on education. Even competitive countries have marginal taxes close to 50%, but it is about how do you invest these tax revenues. Do they go to the people of the country? Are they invested in the right way? Then coming back to the bigger picture now, what are we faced with on this globalization picture? We are moving from 7 billion people today to 10 billion in 2050. Imagine just all the jobs that have to be created. We still need global growth. Without global growth, we will not have these jobs created. The global trade system with WTO has also opened up for countries that were poor to enter the global market. We should not forget that. That's created challenges in some of the developed countries, but in the middle-income countries, this has created enormous opportunities. And as was also said by someone here, that 70% of the jobs that we are seeing gone now in the US or also in Europe are related to technological changes. 30% is due to the competition. I don't think in the future we can stop or should stop competition or this globalization, but we have to look at those policies that are necessary to make the growth more inclusive, sustainable, and job creating. That's why also the World Economic Forum has convened groups looking at sustainable investment dialogues. We are also part of this global alliance for trade facilitation, making sure that developing countries can take part of this because their challenge is that they're under-globalized. And then we also have to have an inclusive global value chain platform, and this is what we are initiating. I could have gone on, but I see you're getting a little bit anxious, so thank you.
I always look anxious. That's just the way
That's your job.
That's my job, to be anxious. So you advise the OECD, Pierre, on issues of trade unions. What advice are you giving right now?
Well, actually, the TUAC bring a voice to the OECD, the voice of organized labor, of National Trade Union Confederation. And we spent quite a lot of time whispering at the ears, both of the OECD staff, the OECD Secretariat, and member states. Let me perhaps first thank Stefan Löfven and the Swedish government for launching this initiative. Rest assured that the labor movement firmly supports the global deal, and for a simple reason, it's actually part of our own business to do social dialogue. That's why we're here. That's why we are here at the local level, at national level, and at the international level. And we will do our best to mobilize all the stakeholders, including business groups, to join this initiative. 3 remarks that I will share with you. I'm lucky because I'm coming at the end of this conversation this morning, so I can do some mini wrap-up in the time that is allocated with you. On the global governance system first. Guy RYDER mentioned that, in fact, we are celebrating, for good or for bad, important events that was held in end of 96 and in 97. The third WTO ministerial in Singapore in December 96. I was not there, but I took the time to read the transcript of the preparatory meeting that trade unions were organizing weeks before this important ministerial. And we were very confident, we were fairly confident that in Singapore we would obtain a deal for better cooperation, for a mechanism between the WTO and the ILO. Obviously, we did not get that. And without dwelling into detail, that was a bit of a traumatic moment for the labor movement. Perhaps it being a moment where a part of the labor movement changed position vis-à-vis trade. 6 months later, in Paris, the OECD failed to come up with an agreement on a multilateral investment agreement, the MAI. And this time, it went the other round. It was an initiative to strengthen governance, to strengthen coherence within not a global level, but a fairly important size of the economy. And it failed because perhaps, and for sure, in fact, this was an agreement that did not respect all the stakeholders of trade, of investment. I did not take due account of the right to regulate. So that was 20 years ago. So from a trade perspective, clearly we have an incomplete governance system we are, and for sure the way further would be to what Gaira mentioned, a robust and credible renewed conversation between this House and the ILO, but also perhaps indeed other institutions. Tax was mentioned. 60% of trade happens within multinational enterprises. How that wealth is distributed is depending on transfer pricing guidelines. Tax matters not only to fund public services, it also matters to ensure a fair distribution of wealth created by trade, or at least by these 60% of trade that happens within multinational enterprises. A second message I will share with you from a trading perspective is what is the model that we want on the domestic front. We agree, no one size fits all. We are not all Swedish, okay? But I think we all agree that there are some pretty good best practices that we can share from the Nordic country. Particularly this idea, and I'm quoting again Guy, but this idea that this is not a zero-sum game that we are dealing with. How to improve? I must say, from the labor perspective, we are not necessarily too enthusiastic with a model that would boil down to compensate the losers in a vast creative destruction game, you know, with a bit more social safety net, a bit more redistribution. We need more than that. So part of the solution is indeed more skills, more access to skills, skills, as the OECD would say. But, okay, that's good, but we don't think that's actually tackling the issue of workers in Foxconn, in the supply chain of Samsung. These are people, they need for sure more skills, but they need first and foremost respect for basic occupational health and safety standards. If they need skills, it's skills for the right to organize collectively. So our basic message, perhaps on the domestic front, is that, yes, why not engage a conversation on flexibility, in fact? It's true that from the labor movement, it's not necessarily a word that we like. But what we'll say is simply, let's have flexibility that is negotiated between the stakeholders, between employers and unions, and flexibility that is collectively organized, that is collectively managed. And this is where the initiative of Global Deal has an important, perhaps, message, is to, whether you use the word adaptability, adjustment, or flexibility, it's something that has to be negotiated between the key stakeholders of the company. And that obviously would include this in a context where, you know, whether you like it or not, there is an erosion of the bargaining power of one party in this business, which is workers. And there is a very clear indicator of that. It's the gap between productivity increase and wage increase. So on the domestic front, no one size fits all, but you need to reverse this trend toward the transfer of risk from employers onto workers and the individualization of risk. And to reconsider this notion, yes, we need to adapt, yes, we need to be innovative, but this has to be negotiated collectively. And we have the tools, collective bargaining agreements, firm level, collective bargaining agreement at sector-wide agreement, that's essential to ensure level playing field, and fairly good individual employment protection legislation. The third message is to bring this opportunity to reflect a bit on the business model that we want for the future, and how the existing agenda on responsible business conduct can fit in that respect. It is clear that today the employer responsibility do not match the ownership of a company. The OECD, the ILO agreed that that an employer, a company, has a responsibility in the supply chain outside its own legal perimeter. So we have that's the first issue. The second one is we are, with digitalization, facing increasing fragmentation of businesses. And this brings a lot of important challenges for us, for the labor movement. How do we engage with whom? Who is having, where do you identify the right employer responsibilities? On that front, one aspect to keep in mind is to strengthen further the instruments that exist, that are already here. We have the ILO Tripartite Declaration on Social Policy, which was revised. We have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And we have a new emerging conversation on due diligence. And beyond that, let's also reflect again on what is a firm. There are again good examples to bring on board from Sweden, from the rest of Europe, on the existence of works council, stakeholder governance, models that precisely, again, ensure a good balance of the risk and of the benefits created by wealth, balance between the shareholders, the management, and the workers. Thank you.
Pierre, thank you very much. Let's turn our thoughts now to the corporate sector and Joachim Reiter from Vodafone Group. Joachim, you've heard about some of the ideas being floated. How does it work within Vodafone Group?
Thank you very much. Maybe I want to contextualize this a bit, and to be honest, we actually come together here because we have a shared concern. And by and large, I think actually, having listened to everyone, is that we have also, by and large, a shared diagnosis. Now, that's a good thing. I have 3 messages related to that. Number 1 is that for the most part, we have discussed the challenges we're facing today, and I want to highlight what we're seeing in the future. I would like to say that Mark was absolutely right not to distinguish between trade and technology. And my message number 1 is we have not seen anything yet. Now, that's to some extent good news, because trade and technology are providing, as the Prime Minister said, an incredible force for good, empowerment of people, addressing persistent problems of marginalization. But, as we have also discussed, both trade and technology, and I would treat them as one, are also incredible sources of disruption. Now, if you take Vodafone, we're basically one of the key pipeline layers, if we can put that, for digital transformation. So we're enabled the digital transformation that's going around all across the world today. We're also one of the first victims of it. And therefore I can say with some comfort and with some accuracy that the disruption that we're about to enter into, as the digital technologies is fully incorporated into the traditional sectors, like in agriculture and manufacturing, it will be a very, very different discussion that we're going to have in 10 years' time. So we need to be able to handle today's problem, but we also need to rig ourselves to handle tomorrow's problem. So the DG AZEVÊDO was absolutely right when he said this is unprecedented and exponential. Now my second point is agility and adaptability is key in this future environment. And this is not agility and adaptability for the few, but for all. Now I want to underline, in the case of Vodafone, our view is crystal clear. Inclusivity is sustainable growth, and leaving no bound behind is sustainable profitability. In other words, the fact that we are dealing with persistent and growing inequalities, both in opportunities and in outcomes of our current economic system, is not good for the corporate sector at large, just as it is not good for economies or for the individuals affected. Now, with respect to opportunities, I want to underline that in our assessment, and we operate in many developing countries, particularly in some of the poorest in Africa, we see far too many people not actually having access to be able to participate in global trade and investment. This is a marginalization by the lack of opportunity, not by the fact that they've been affected by the change that has happened. They have had too little change, not too much. These includes rural communities, women, small and medium-sized companies. We have another mirror image of this problem, which is the outcomes or the inequality of outcomes that have come with the very rapid change and the increasing rapid change that we're seeing today. These are, both of them, drivers for instability and anxiety in all of our societies. The demographic dividend that we are talking about in positive terms, in terms of Africa, can very quickly, if it's not a more equality of opportunities, turn into a source of instability, frustration, and political crisis, none of which is good for the corporate sector. Now, when it comes to how we see the next step and where do we want to go forward, I think the German, Vodafone's German CEO put it very nicely in a blog post, I think it's just a few days ago actually, where it says that Vodafone is striving in every local market that we are working to establish digital social market economy. Now, the word social here is absolutely crucial, because it's not about protecting companies, it is about protecting people. A functioning market economy will require companies to go bust and fail. we cannot have a functioning economy if we treat all companies as Hotel California, where you check in but you can never check out. However, this implies also that technology and trade will have to be broken out of its quite narrow, siloed approach and be treated as a broader societal transformational issue. In our view, we work very closely in every local market that we operate in to try to address what are legitimate concerns around the anxiety of the technology that we enable. Let me just highlight a few to contextualize and to be very concrete. First, skills. Second, financial inclusion. Third, health. Actually, not a lot of people know that we run one of the largest health programs in Africa for maternal health. Fourth, agriculture upgrading and SME upgrading in terms of their capabilities. Fifth, women. We have committed to connect an additional 60 million women within 5 years. With respect to our own staff, and this is for the societies we operate in, with respect to our own staff, absolutely correct, as the representative of the trade unions highlighted, global safety and health policy is an absolute requirement for corporates today. We cannot simply accept that a family in India would be worried about having their husband or wife being sent to a workplace run by Vodafone in a different manner than a family in Germany. So we have established a standard that is applicable for the same engineer, irrespective of the local conditions in each of the markets we operate. We also have a global maternal program because we actually think it's absolutely crucial that women has a proper career opportunity in Vodafone and are not discriminated against because they are delivering children. And for that reason, despite the fact that many countries have not established good support for women as they become mothers or for fathers as they become fathers, we have basically a global maternal program. There's also raised the issue of tax. We're among the few countries that already today file a public tax report that indicate what we contribute in tax and jobs country by country, which is something that the EU is currently looking at. So from our point of view, we have both a local commitment in every market that we operate in, and we have a commitment to our staff. The issue around the commitment to our staff is crystal clear. We belong to the service economy. In the end, our entire success is dependent on our people. This is our foremost asset. And therefore, it makes no sense whatsoever commercially, let alone morally and ethically, to treat any of our staff in a negative way or to try to exploit through short-term benefits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Joachim. Thank you very much indeed. I thought it was much of what you said very interesting there, but what leapt out to me in particular was that it is not in the interests of the corporate world to see this disparity of wealth and to see this inequality develop, because quite simply you can't sell your products to people who are not benefiting from the development of trade. So I think that's very interesting. It's also not in the interest of governments to allow this to develop. It causes social disintegration and social unrest and voting patterns which governments probably find difficulty with. So at the point at which you move away from something being a moral imperative, in my experience, having covered business views for a long time, when it stops becoming just a moral imperative and becomes an economic one, then you start to get traction on some of these problems. So we have a little bit of time now. We have 10 minutes. I'd like to take some questions from the floor. I know we have the Canadian, yes, I will come to you. I know we have the Canadian ambassador, I believe, somewhere here who would like to ask a question. If you'd like to, is that correct? Oh, you're here, but you have no desire to ask a question at all.
I am here and I have desires to ask all kinds of questions, but I would welcome questions from others in the room.
Okay. I think, yes, please, if you'd like to, yes, please, let's come to you first. If you'd like to say who you are and where you're from, please.
Oui, bonjour à tous.
Oh, sorry, just this gentleman. I beg your pardon. Yes, I'll come to you afterwards. I understand that you wanted to ask a question first. Yes, please.
Sorry, my name is Hector Torres. I'm right now with Canadian think tank CG, but I've been at the IMF and the WTO for many years.
Okay, Canadian think tank, yeah. What is your question, please?
My question is, it has been said here several times by several speakers that adjustment policies have to be defined nationally. They will respond to domestic choices, policy choices.
Yes.
Now, however, implementing those policies may require important fiscal efforts. They may even imply imposing structural changes that may bring costs to the private sector. So they may affect firms' competitiveness. So my question is, isn't it, those are domestic policy choices, we agree, and they have to be idiosyncratic. But isn't it a bit disingenuous to pretend that they could be done, these adjustment policies, nationally? Shouldn't they be implemented in a coherent way? Because otherwise they could compound trade tensions.
Yeah, okay, so there needs to be some sort of international forum, is what you're saying.
I would say promoting coherence in economic policy.
Should they be, okay, so we have accepted that it's not one size fits all, however, there needs to be some level of coherence. Would anybody from the previous panel or this panel like to address that question? Yes, please, Borge.
I'll give it a try. Of course, we have existing institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions that have partly that in their mandate, but we know the whole multilateral system, if we also then focus on the UN and, for example, ECOSOC that could have taken on such a responsibility. We know that it was supposed to be the Security Council for Economic and Social Issues. We know that to get consensus in the UN these days, we are in a polarized, fractured world, is not easy. So how to address this in a practical way? I have to say that the EU leadership in this has been important. You have to also be a big enough market. I think that is your point. You have to be many players and actors coming together addressing this, and what EU has done on competition, but also what the EU has done when it comes to addressing this tax base question. I think that's one of the elephants in the room. And of course, when you have companies that get a lot of revenues from one country and it is not having its tax base in that country, this is one of the issues that have to be discussed, and I think the EU is addressing this now heads on. Ideally, in an ideal world, we should also see a more multilateral approach to that. That would be my preferred solution. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. That's why also the World Economic Forum, with our platform, being the International Organization for Public-Private Partnership, will play a role here. We invite companies, we invite civil society and governments to come together, for example, address the fourth industrial revolution. What is the societal effect of such a revolution? Will we for the first time address a revolution, a paradigm shift in that way, that are creating less jobs than more jobs? I don't hope so. Done in the right way, I think we can avoid it, but it also means, and it takes savvy policies to avoid this.
So trade blocks might be the one centre, and there might be, but it is an interesting question. I interrupted the French ambassador. I'm extremely sorry. Please, would you like to give us your question?
Merci Madame la Présidente. Elisabeth Lorrain, ambassadeur de France. Je voudrais d'abord saluer le Premier ministre de Suède et saluer son initiative du Global Deal. Je voudrais confirmer que la France a rejoint cette initiative le 17 novembre dernier lors du sommet social de Göteborg. Et comme l'a indiqué notre président de la République, nous pensons que cette initiative est exactement ce dont nos sociétés ont besoin et dont nos économies ont besoin. Alors je crois que le format de cette initiative est particulièrement intéressant. On le retrouve un peu autour des panélistes dans cette salle, avec cette association d'organisations internationales, en particulier l'OIT et l'OCDE, mais aussi les entreprises. Je crois que ce n'est pas si fréquent, qu'il faut le noter, et que cela va nous permettre d'aller de l'avant. Je crois aussi que ce qui est important pour nous, c'est que dans cette démarche, on intègre pleinement la question de la promotion des standards de dialogue social dans le monde. Car pour nous, le dialogue social est une valeur partagée qui contribue et qui doit être partagée et qui contribue à la croissance et au développement. L'initiative du Global Deal a déjà retenu l'attention des partenaires sociaux en France. De même, déjà, des groupes français ont adhéré à cette initiative et nous continuons, sous l'égide de la ministre du Travail, à vouloir fédérer et consolider cet élan. Je crois que ce qui est important pour nous, et comme l'a dit le directeur général de l'OIT, c'est le dialogue social, C'est un élément clé pour pouvoir progresser ensemble dans tous les domaines. Je vous remercie.
Right, well, my French is reasonable, but it's not that great. So I understand what you were saying about France's engagement in the global deal and its value. I missed, I think, what the question was in there. Is anybody good enough at French to tell me?
Non, il n'y avait pas.
No, that's okay. So my French was better than I thought. Thank heavens for that. It's not often that happens to me, I can tell you. Right, so any other questions, please? Yes, please. So can I come to this lady first at the front? Would you tell us where you're from and your name, please?
I'm the ambassador of Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much.
Yes. No, just wanted to react to a number of things. First of all, when we talk about technology and employment, we're talking about retraining, and I just wanted to ask, what is the role of the educational institutions in terms of looking at their curricula to fit them to the labour market?
Ah, yes, that's an interesting question.
My second question relates to, I think it was from the panelists on WEF, who mentioned about looking at the global trade rules in relation to policy space. And one thing which has come out in the trade policy reviews here is that many of our countries have come out with a local content policy, and we have been questioned whether this was in line with TRIMS. But for us, the local content policy is so important because we are looking for employment.
Yes.
And it's very important. So this is one instance where I believe, I don't know how that could be addressed, but I believe for us it's extremely important, the local content policy. But then we have to respond whether or not it's in line with the TRIMS. And the third last question, quickly, it's on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
Nobody is to be left behind. There's a whole portion on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which talks about trade as an engine for development. How do the panelists see this? Because the contents of that paragraph, I mean, now we are having all sorts of problems in terms of implementing what the contents of that paragraph. For us, how do you see this in terms of us not being left behind, which is the theme of the Sustainable Development Goals, if what is prescribed under trade is not happening? Thank you.
Okay, let's. I'm assuming certainly in the UK, universities are greedy enough to want to adapt their curriculum to to draw students in. So let's assume for a moment there's enough commercial interest there. Local policy space and the issue of the Sustainable Development Goal, nobody left behind. Anybody want to talk about either of those two things? And then we have to finish, otherwise I will be in trouble. Yes, please. JOAKIM.
Right. Our the educational system keeping track with the digital transformation? The answer is no. And that's why, for example, we have developed e-learning platforms to try to develop coding skills, not least in Africa. We are working with the Ministry of Education in every market that we operate. We do it together with Google and a number of other actors, bringing different actors together, Columbia University, to have the best education. But we have to link it to the local curriculum, because otherwise, what's the point, to be honest? So we are working very hard in every local market with the local Ministry of Education to make sure that they also upgrade the curriculum. I think there's a real problem here, because government both on the political side and the administrative side are having huge problems trying to anticipate what is something that is moving super fast.
Yeah.
And so, just to be very clear, could I just say on local content policies, if you're talking about local content that will empower people to actually be better participants in the local economy and therefore drive better benefits out of global trade or globalization at large, this is absolutely fine. I mean, in the end, if you, for example, talk about the app industry, e-commerce platforms, if it's not locally attuned, and we saw that, for example, in Turkey, where women could not access the more advanced e-commerce platforms, so we developed an SMS service so they could upload. So you need to always localize the content in the sense of empowering people. There's a different question going around in WTO as well as facing companies, which is where governments try to say, well, I don't have this manufacturing today, could I have it tomorrow? So to give you a concrete example, should the servers over cloud that you have in your country be produced in Sierra Leone, or should the content in that cloud be attuned to the local needs? These are two separate questions. The latter one is crystal clear. It's from an economic point of view as well. The former one will be very tricky, and the reality is that the cloud development and network virtualization and all the other good things that will come with digital will come much later to countries that put such technological requirements.
Well, I believe, there we must leave it. It is now 10 to 1, and I've been told that we must finish this panel. It's a fascinating point at which we leave it. I regret having to leave it. I'd like to thank our panellists once again and invite back to the stage the Prime Minister of Sweden, Roberto, of the Director General of WTA, and also Guy Ryder, who's already with me, the Director General of the ILO. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Just as we... Okay. Just as we're waiting for the panellists to take their seats, there's been much mention of the Sustainable Development Goals, and No One Left Behind is one of them. But of course, we've got Sustainable Development Goal 8 on decent work, 10 on reducing inequality, 17 on partnerships. There is a great deal of momentum behind the global deal, I'm pleased to say. So please allow me to welcome back Stefan Löfven, the Swedish Prime Minister.
Thank you so much, and thanks. It was a pleasure listening to all these contributions. Just a few perspectives to conclude. First, I'm very pleased that WTO will look at different cases, also which policies work best to handle these changes. I look forward to that. I would like to add a perspective that we haven't brought up, including myself, and that is the gender perspective. I think we need to be very cautious here, as we do with all different policies, that we bring in the gender perspective. So we're screening all our policies also from a gender perspective, because that needs to be done. So I would like to add that. Secondly, I think someone mentioned the pace and the scale of the changes that we're already have, but also in front of us. I think that is an even stronger motivation for a social dialogue, because I think what we are facing is the unknown. We try to predict how the society will develop and change, and some we can predict, but not everything. And that means that we have to be even more cautious on having this dialogue, so that we can predict the best we can. But that must include all the stakeholders, the actors, because if not, it will be more difficult to handle. Another thing is that we are dependent on one another. I think that is crucial also to see. This will not happen if we cannot act together, because the best result will be when we act together. I just want to mention a very concrete example from the company in which I used to work as a welder. Some 30 years ago, we were approached by the company, and they said, we need to increase the productivity in our company, because otherwise this manufacturing will take place in another company. Can you do anything about it? And we said, we'll look into it. We came out with the results: 30% increased productivity. 30. How was that possible? Because it meant that almost a third of the workforce in that part of production had to leave that production and go into something else. It was possible because I knew when I negotiated with the company that, yes, some of the workers had to leave, but they will have a job in some other part of the company. If you take that perspective into a national perspective, what does it say? This kind of change needs to be handled together. So if you lose your job there, you know that you will get help, support for the retraining, you find a path to a new job, and while doing so, you will manage also from an economic point of view. It won't be a disaster. If you don't have that in front of you, you will resist change the most you can. So that is, for me, a very, very clear example that we need to find this. And this is not, as someone said, this is not a zero-sum game. This is not about arm wrestling between employers and employees on how to divide a volume that will never change. This is about win-win-win. If we can create conditions in which we cooperate, it'll be an increased wealth to share. And yes, at some point there will be some arm wrestling, negotiating, of course, but it's. I think we need to look into that. Lastly, about the labor market. If we look at the labor market as there's one supply side, there's a demand side, and we look at the supply side. How do we train and equip the workforce with the best competence ever that we can do? Is one side of it, yes. But the demand side is also important. How do we develop the new products? What are the best innovation systems? New products, be it goods or services that we can sell, is also important, because in that way we know, yes, there will be jobs in the future as well. But I thank WTO for this cooperation, and yeah.
And thank you very much. Guy, a few comments from you, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, no, I'll be quick. After listening to the Prime Minister, I think one of the very encouraging things about the conversation this morning has been the very high level of consensus that I detect in the room. I think this organisation works on the basis of unanimity, Roberto, so I don't know if we had unanimity in the room, but there seems to be a very clear understanding that, yes, trade is the absolutely necessary engine of growth and greater prosperity, but those benefits do not come automatically. They require policy interventions, and we need to think much more carefully, perhaps, than we have done in the past about what those interventions look like and how we make them happen. So I think there's a lot of consensus about the what we need to do. I think the question now is how we're going to go about it. And here, just to say something a little bit sort of close to home for the ILO and the WTO, I think it's very important for me to underline, and we very much appreciate it, Roberto, that we have been working together much more closely in recent years. You've mentioned the joint work we do on skills in relation to inclusive trade. We're not in the place we were 20 years ago, when you did have the impression there was a sort of a separation wall down the avenue, the Rue de Lausanne, which kept the ILO away from the WTO, and directors general met clandestinely, which is actually the pure truth of the matter. We're a long way away from that, and yet could I suggest and we're meeting under the sign of dialogue here, can I suggest that we need to do a little bit better, not just the ILO and the WTO, but the international system in general, coming together, working out all of these highly interrelated issues, because some of you have talked about tax, some of you talked about skills, some have talked about global supply chains. You know, nobody's got the whole part of the answer there, but they're all pieces of the answer, and we need to put the pieces together. And that passes through processes of dialogue. And I do hope, and it's a sort of a second dimension, Prime Minister, to the global deal, that at the same time as countries are signing up, France has just done so, and it's great news. I wonder if international institutions can come together in the same spirit of dialogue and make the best use of the space that you're making available to us.
Hear, hear. Guy, thank you very much, and over to you.
That's good. Well, thank you. I'm very happy with what we had this morning, that we had this conversation. The WTO decides things by consensus, but we prize diversity. So the diversity of views is very much welcome. And I think that one important message that I got out of this is that we need to have an honest conversation on all this. And honest on all sides. And to be frank with you, it's very easy to know who is not being honest in a conversation. It's the other guy. Very easy. Always. Always the other guy. So I think we all agree that having this dialogue is important. Some symptoms of the problems we have are quite clear. Inequality is rising. That's a clear symptom. Jobs are being lost. That's also quite clear. These disruptions in the labor market are very evident. Now, while the symptoms are clear, it's important that we get the right causes. Because if we get the wrong cause, we're going for the wrong solution. That I think, is the problem. And I don't think we're quite there yet in identifying the problems. Now, I heard today that, you know, trade and technology, all those things are there together. That's quite true. But how do you identify the real cause, if it's those two together? How much each one? Do we need to quantify that or not? And what are the solutions that will address those problems? I think while even the problem may be easier to identify, finding the solutions is going to be very, very hard. Because I said before, and I repeat, there is not one size fits all. And not because it is technically impossible. It is because it is politically impossible. Politically impossible. Each country will have their own political reality, their own political circumstances. And the debate will come out differently in the different countries. So we have to recognize that. Now, having said that, we need to understand things a little bit more. We talked about global value chains. We talked about harmonization of labor standards. That's very, very tricky. Let's be honest with each other. If we're talking about honesty, let's be honest with each other. And I have seen this conversation for a long time in the WTO. When I entered my career, this conversation was already there. And it's very tricky because oftentimes, I'm not saying all the time, but oftentimes, those who wanted the harmonization, they were not looking at a harmonization of the standards. They were looking at a harmonization of the costs. Now, that's a different proposition. And often, people were looking at this as a zero-sum game. So unemployment that is created in a developing country is an employment that was not created in my country. Now, under that perspective, this is a very, very tricky conversation. Now, if you want to have it, fine, but let's go beyond the boxes. Just staying inside the boxes is not going to do it. You have to have a real deep, honest conversation about this. Now, I'm not sure that we're ready for that. Members and the international community will have to tell us whether we're ready for that. What is true is that we need to do more research. We need to have an informed conversation about all this. And I think some notions are already out there. We talked about, and I think Sabina mentioned that just skill is not enough. I think it's much broader than that. It's about education. What kind of education? It's an even tougher question. When you have a study recently by the World Bank that shows that 2/3 of the kids who enter fundamental school will end up working in jobs that don't exist yet. How do you prepare for that situation? My granddaughter, she's 1.5 years old. Her father was traveling, and before coming back, he called home and he said, what do you want as a gift? And she barely speaks. And she said, Papad. Papad is an iPad. All right? She's 1.5 years old. Now, what do? Do you take away the iPad? No, that's too early for you. Or do you prepare that kid for the world of today? I think that's a challenge we all face. That's a challenge we all face. I don't think rejecting technology, rejecting innovation, or rejecting labor is the answer. It's about how do you adapt to those very fundamental, very critical changes, which are inevitable. It's going to be there. Now, I don't have the answers. I don't think anybody in this room has the answers. But collectively, we may have the answer. And I think that's what we need to do. That's what the global deal is all about. That's what the WTO is willing to do. With an honest conversation, researching and being open for diversity, different views, and trying to get some kind of light in this situation. So thank you all very much. Once again, it was an honor to have you all here, and let's continue this conversation. This is just the beginning.
Prime Minister, once again, thank you so much for your initiative on this subject. Let's put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. Let's start now and let's start here. Thank you so much for your participation, and also to both Director Generals. If you have difficulty communicating, there's a man from Vodafone who can help you out, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, it was a very, very good job.